Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to the first episode of our 7th season of Intimate Judaism. I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn. It has been an honor and a privilege to have been with you for the past 6 seasons, and I hope you're as excited as we are for what the next season will bring. Talli, what are we talking about today?
I'm really pleased that we have a guest, Rav Yoni Rosensweig, where we are going to present Rav Yoni with the kind of dilemmas and halachic issues that he sees as a kind of expert in mental health and halacha. We're going to talk to him specifically about issues having to do with intimacy, which is what our podcast is about, but also specifically the type of halachic questions, specifically in the past year with the war, but also speak more generally.
We'll get to our conversation in just a moment. First, check out our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikveh checklist, and more. Subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts, rate and review. Please leave a comment. And also, please tell people about Intimate Judaism and share the podcast so that we can continue to grow our audience. I'm now pleased to introduce our guest for today, Rav Yoni Rosensweig, who is the rabbi of the Netzach Menashe community in Beit Shemesh and founder of Maagalei Nefesh Center for Halacha, Community, and Mental Health. Rav Yoni, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, Rav Yoni, I'm going to start by opening up with the first question. What Rav Scott and I would like to do today is kind of bring some questions to you with your expertise. And I'd like to just start out more generally. We're in the month of Elul. We generally start our first podcast of the year in Elul, where we often will reflect on issues having to do with relationships and repair. As we reflect on our relationship with God, with others, and with ourselves, tshuva is a big part of this experience. And I think that also you as a Rav and Rav Scott, and I certainly as a therapist, do confront people with their sexual guilt and shame, with guilt and shame in general, but specifically with sexual regrets. So as a Rav well-versed in pastoral counseling, how would you counsel individuals seeking guidance on healing their or dealing with their issues of sexual guilt and shame and difficulties with the process of tshuva?
That's a great question and complicated for sure. Okay. I'm going to give like a general view of this and then try to hone in on the specific question that you asked with regards to sexual shame and guilt. Okay. So let me start off by saying this, which is that I believe that any process, right, that involves a feeling like shame and guilt could be positive depending on what comes after that and what came before that. So I'll give an example from the 9 days and the 3 weeks, just because I think that that's going to help to explain my point, right? People say to me during that time, which is, of course, devoted to the destruction of the temple and mourning for the destruction of the temple. So some people say to me, oh, I have depression, right? What should I do during that time? Should I also be mourning? It's going to exacerbate my depression. And then they say, right, then they add to that, actually, maybe that's a good thing, right? I'm supposed to be depressed. I'm supposed to be, in this mood. So isn't it actually a positive? Like here, I'm ready. I'm ready. I'm already in the mood. I'm already there. I fit into the atmosphere. So my answer to that is yes and no. On the one hand, you're right that people are supposed to feel a little bit more moody, a little bit lower in terms of their spirit, their energy during that time. Sure, that's not incorrect to think that is so. However, there are two differences here. First of all, you're supposed to feel that maybe more about the mikdash, about certain external factors, rather than about yourself. Thinking that you're nothing or that you're not feeling whatever, etc. But there's another point here which I think goes more to the issue that we're talking about. What happens on the 10th of Av? What happens on the 11th of Av? On the 12th? Etc. In other words, when you say that I'm already in the mood because I'm suffering from depression, sure. So I guess we all go through a process during the 3 weeks, 9 days, and then Tisha B'Av. But then for most of us, we get up the next morning and we put on some music and we go out to a restaurant, with our wives or our husbands, and we go with our kids somewhere and we have a good time. Yeah. And the moodiness is gone and the depression is over, right? So in other words, we look at that period of time, the 3 weeks and the 9 days, as transitional. It's transitional. It's meant to be there for a certain amount of time, but then we move on. We're supposed to learn something from that. We're supposed to take something from that. In general, right, Judaism is a cycle. It's cyclical in the way that it's built, right? So we have Pesach, and then Sfirat HaOmer, and Shavuot, and the 9 days, and Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Simchas Torah. It's cyclical, and again and again and again, rinse and repeat, etc. But if it's not cyclical, right? So if a person is feeling that way all the time, or if it's exacerbated by that time, so then even after the 9th of Av, you're feeling all the more depressed and all the more down, etc. And actually, in fact, it's worsened. Then you've missed the point. I think that feelings of shame and guilt can be positive, but only if they're positive, meaning only if they lead to something, right? If a person sinks deep down into a feeling of shame and guilt, and they live in that, and they stew in that, and they stay in that, etc., there's nothing positive about that. For example, a question that comes up a lot, right? Let's say masturbation. Depends, right? Should a person do tshuva for that? It really depends what that looks like to me. Of course, the halacha is against that, sure. And of course, a person should, feel like, okay, maybe I did something wrong. Okay, but for many young men, it's more than that. They don't just feel like they did something wrong. They feel like they did the most wrong thing that they could do. They feel like they've let themselves down. They've let God down. That there's no way back for them. That the crime that they have done is so heinous. That they will never live it down. Et cetera, et cetera. That they are like the lowest of the low. The feeling of shame and guilt here is so negative and so damaging that it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, right? So charata, right? When we talk about the process of tshuva, right? We talk about charata, about having remorse, for what has occurred, doing vidui, right, confessing what has happened, and then after that, there's also kabbalah la'atid. There's also tshuva and kabbalah la'atid, meaning there's a way forwards. So what I'm worried about, to sum up my answer to your question, right? What I'm worried about with sexual shame and guilt is that it doesn't lend itself to moving forwards, right? So if a person has shame and guilt of the kind that make them feel like a bad person, in the sense that there's no way from here, there's no way up, there's no way out, et cetera, et cetera, that's a negative way to feel shame and guilt, and it's not what the Torah meant at all in the process of tshuva. But if a person feels that shame and guilt in a constructive way, meaning to say, hey, look what I've done. It's not great. Yeah, I should be doing better things. I should be moving forwards. I should figure out how to get out of this thing, right? That's a positive in my eyes.
Rav Yoni, my follow-up question to that is that what you said sounds very reasonable and logical and compassionate. Part of the problem for many people, I believe, is that many of our texts themselves might lead them to believe in the first kind of shame and guilt. I've mentioned this example before, but if somebody reads the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch about masturbation, given the example you just mentioned, it is very, very stark and I'll say guilt-inducing. It basically does say it's the worst thing you can do. Moreover, even other things such as Tfilat Zakah, which many people say before Kol Nidre, these say, I look at all of my various limbs and they're all filled with sin. It sounds a little bit, at least on the surface, as though these texts are more of the first kind of shame and guilt, which are saying you are worthless, you're nothing. Of course, they're in the process of tshuva, they're telling you to change, but should you not change, you're just a piece of garbage, to put it in stark terms. So how are people supposed to have the positive kind of shame and guilt when there are some texts that we have as part of our tradition, which may be guilt-inducing in the negative sense?
Right, 100%. You're right. I don't want to anachronistically, read those texts in a way that they didn't mean. And it could be that you're absolutely right. That Tfilah Zakah is a good example of that, of something, of a text, where, 100%, it's really meant to make a person feel that sort of shame, right? But to this, I'll say two things, okay? First of all, I think that I once, Rav Soloveitchik has a very interesting piece called Ra'ayonot al Hatfilah, Reflections on the Amida, it's called in English. It appears at the end of Ish Halacha in Hebrew. and I think it appears in what was it, Worship of the Heart in English. I think it's in there, where he explains something really interesting about the first three brachas. And I'm going to make this short. I don't want to belabor your to tax your listeners. He says that the three first brachas of the Shmoneh Esrei are actually of three different aspects or facets of God. One is Magen Avraham. Hashem is, ever kind, ever kind, everlasting kindness, Chesed, etc., etc. The second one is Mechayeh HaMeitim, which talks about Hashem not as Chesed per se, but as Gvura, meaning someone who basically comes and saves you. So it's Mechayeh Meitim, even though you're dead, Hashem comes in and brings you back to life. In other words, He saved you from trouble. It's not Chesed. Chesed is like, kind of like more of a positive sense. Like not that you're in trouble, just Hashem gives you bounty, right? Mechayeh Meitim is when you're in trouble and Hashem saves you. Ha'ela Kadosh, which is a very short bracha and basically says almost nothing. In other words, it's hard to even decipher what it means. Is talking about Hashem as mysterious, as what the Rabbi would call numinous. In other words, beyond reach, beyond understanding, et cetera, which sometimes God appears to us in that way. And what the Rabbi is trying to say over there is, and this is, I don't remember the exact words, but he's not saying we shouldn't say all three brachas, but I think he means to say the following, that on some level, when we stand up to daven at the beginning of the day, we should choose a bracha. Now, obviously, he means we should say all three, but on some days I experience God as Magen Avraham, and on some days I experience God as Ha'ela Kadosh. Right? If I get up in the morning and I read that 6 of the hostages were killed, I might connect more to Ha'ela Kadosh, to God as mysterious, as not there, as completely not understandable, rather than Magen Avraham or Mechayeh Meitim. In the same way, with this, I'll end my point. In the same way, I would say regarding these texts, which is, how many of them are really relevant to us, right? There are a lot of texts that are there. For some, and I would count myself among those people, Tefillah Zakah is meaningful. Like I read Tefillah Zakah, I do find it meaningful. I have learned over the years not to take it to heart in the way that it's written. I take part of it to heart, but I don't really, just like read it and say, okay, so I'm all bad, et cetera, although that is what it says. I'm not saying that it doesn't say that. Yeah. But, I've learned to kind of like parse it out and read it in a certain way. But more, I would say, just one more point. I have received a shaila. Okay, this is I said it before, there are 2 points. The second point is this. I received more than once a shaila from people with depression who ask me, do I need to say everything in davening? For example, what's called the Tfilat Rava. Elohai ad shelo notzarti eini chedai, ועכשיו שנוצרתי כאילו לא נוצרתי, עפר אני בחיי, קל וחומר במיתתי, הרי אני לפניך ככלי מלא בושה וכלימה, right? So all this talk about how I'm nothing, I'm just a vessel full of shame, full of guilt, it's better that I wasn't born, that wasn't created. Is this something to say to someone someone with depression or suicidal ideation? So I say to the people, do not say that paragraph. Do not say it. Look, not everything that is in the davening we need to say. So 100%. If people can take it positively, great. If they can't, they shouldn't say those texts.
Thank you. When you were speaking, I was thinking about how, there are so many texts that bring up so many different aspects of our relationship with God. And this is you bringing this Rav Soloveitchik talking about these different brachot and the different aspects of God that it conjures up. And this is true for Rosh Hashanah and God as Father, God as Judge, God as King, and God as lover, God as the person that we relate to on an intimate level. And I think that being able to integrate different parts of that in ourselves seems to be what could be helpful. There are times when, like you said, we need the shame and guilt. Like we need to have the super ego in ourselves, that moral voice. But there are also times that we really need to have a lot of self-compassion and a lot of self-forgiveness. And that kind of leads me to the next question, because as you were speaking about Tfilat Zakah, and this is why I guess we say, thank God I'm not a man, or however we put it, it got me to thinking about the question of the existential conflict between what in sexual health we would see as normative development of the sexual self, which does include masturbation, for example, or the desire for touch and intimacy, sometimes when you're not yet a married person or when it's not the time of the month that you're allowed. And that constant kind of struggle between a very proscripted allowance for sexual expression and a very strong desire to maintain the spiritual connection and the halachic guidelines, because the identity is very strong in terms of wanting to be good, wanting to follow the law. And this often creates, especially if, you didn't get married at 18 or you have other issues that come up, or again, your husband is at war and only comes home dafka the day that you're in your 7 clean days. I'm just going to throw out, it's basically the entire podcast that we speak about these conflicts. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk about that in terms of, well, there's many questions. There's the question of the existential conflict, how you might offer hashkafic perspective, a philosophical perspective on this ongoing conflict. And also the prioritization. How do you prioritize mental health and wellness over what might actually be, quote unquote, bad for you? In other words, if you're homosexual and you have to sit on that your entire life and not be able to have a relationship, what are the mental health outcomes of that? I mean, I see it in my clinic. Or if you're 40 and haven't gotten married and you have no way of expressing yourself sexually, what are the mental health outcomes? And how do you, as a Rav who is so well versed in mental health, can you talk about this?
Yeah, well, that's a lot of questions. But so if I forget something, you'll let me know. Let's start at the beginning. All right. Let's put aside mental health for a second, okay, and just talk about the ashkafic outline for sexual ethics in halacha. Okay. I know that in many schools still today, and in general, I'm not saying that there are also texts, certainly texts in the Gemara and the Rishonim, I think as well, that could allude to this. I think that there are definitely, and there's definitely an idea that at least before one gets married, that there is some sort of negativity to the sexual act and to sexual behavior. So because the halacha disallows it before a person gets married, what is attached to that many times is like this theological or philosophical negativity as well. Meaning to say, if you, shomer negiah, if you're not shomer negiah before you get married, then that's obviously a violation. But it's not just a violation; you're doing something terrible, not just as a technical violation. Meaning this is negative. You should not be involving yourself in all this physicality, as a negative thing. This transfers, by the way, in some texts also to after marriage. Let's not think that it doesn't. Yeah, the moment you believe that physical contact or the sexual act, right, is generally a negative thing, or shall we say an animalistic thing, then you can definitely find texts that describe it that way also after marriage. And therefore we'll say, people should refrain, they should only do as much as they absolutely need to, et cetera, et cetera. It's that sort of thing, right? So that's where we're at in terms of that. Now, do I think that is accurate? No, I don't think that is accurate, to say the least. Okay, why do I not think that that's accurate? Because the halacha clearly states that after a person gets married, there's an obligation of ona. There's an obligation to have sexual relations. And there are different frequencies are discussed. But in general, right, I don't, and I think that everyone would agree, right, if a couple is not having sex, that's grounds for a divorce, right? Obviously, the sexual component in a marriage is essential to the marriage. It is part of the obligations of the marriage. It goes hand in hand with the marriage, and the marriage is liable to break up without it. So I don't think that anybody can really say that halachically, or philosophically, theologically, that the sexual component is not an essential part of the marriage in the view of the halacha, and therefore in the view of the philosophy of the halacha. Therefore, all this coming to this point. Therefore, to me, it's obvious that a relationship is not complete without a physical component. So when I see two people dating, right, and there's no sexual relations because of Shomer Nagia, right, to me it's obvious that there's something missing there. Meaning they connect emotionally, they connect intellectually, they connect spiritually, but they're not connecting physically. Is that a whole relationship? No, it's not a whole relationship. Do they feel it? Of course they feel it, right? That's the sexual tension that they feel. But instead of just presenting it in an animalistic way, in other words, oh, so obviously, they just want to, they have a desire and they want to act on it. Sure, but it's more than that. In my opinion, it's an existential thing. In other words, people who are connecting on those levels also need to connect on a physical level. I think it's right that they connect on a physical level from that perspective.
So are you saying they should?
No, I'm not saying they should. I'm not done yet.
Okay.
It's only part one.
And you can stop the recording right now. And thank you very much for joining today.
All I'm saying is that, I think sometimes people say, oh, I feel that we should. And then many times rabbis will say, well, that feeling is incorrect, or it's the Yetzer Hara, or it's not right. I'm okay with them feeling that. I don't think it's a Yetzer Hara that they feel that they need to connect on a physical level. I think that's a wonderful thing. I think that they should, with all those connections happening on other levels, they should also want to connect on a physical level. And when they're married, they will, right? And obviously that's a positive, not a negative, that they're attracted to each other. So I think that saying that it's a positive once they get married, but not before, on an essential level is not true. However, with all that said, right? So then you have to ask the question, okay, well, if that's true, then why don't we allow it, right? Then why is it not allowed? And to me, the answer is my opinion, right? I think that the answer is that, of course, there's the alternative, right? In other words, in a society, right, where we do not have any limits on sexual exposure, what happens? We don't have to imagine that. We live in a society like that. Yeah. Western society has, to a large extent, done away with most of the sexual norms, that exist. And have there been only positive results? No. There are also definitely negative results. I'm not talking only about like early pregnancies and things like that. I'm talking about emotional and mental health results, for those early connections. I'm talking about, people, not understanding what love really is, not understanding what they're giving up when they're having a sexual encounter, not understanding what they're expecting and what the reaction will be from the other side. I'm talking about emotional maturity, etc. Once again, I can go to the extremes. I can talk about suicides and this. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking just about the emotional and mental health impact of having, zero sexual norms, basically, in such a reality. So even with issues like, let's say, yichud, we can doubt all we want. Why is the Torah being so strict about what you can't be in the same room with some? I mean, do we not see that? Do we not see, office romances and people cheating on their wives and wives cheating on their husbands because they're in close proximity, to another man? I mean, is that so ridiculous to think that could happen, right? Of course it could happen, right? So I don't think that the laws in and of themselves are so ridiculous. The point being, and this is, I'll end my point here and I'll let you ask the question. My point being only that there are two extremes here. One extreme basically says, well, let's just allow everything, and the other extreme, would say, well, let's just be sure, right? Or let's just prohibit everything. I think that halacha falls somewhere on the stricter side. I think that halacha basically just said, look, we want to allow people, to express themselves sexually, but we want to make sure it's with the right person. So therefore, you should get married first. And then now in the last point, obviously in more ancient times, that was easier because people got married earlier. I got married when I was 20, so, I'm not a good example, but, people definitely today get married when they're older and they date for many more years. And yes, the change in societal norms has led to a greater challenge in terms of keeping the halacha, which I don't think existed, so much in the past, which is also why we don't see as many questions about that, or almost any questions about that in the past, for sure. But do I understand what the logic of the Torah is? I think that the logic is, we want to make sure that whatever you're doing it with the right person at the end of the day, because there could be also damage and flack, from going too far to that direction. That's the basic the gist of that. I have more to say about your question, but I'll let you ask a question.
I mean, I appreciate how you framed it, because what you said was, yeah, it's very difficult. We have these very, I would say, almost extreme laws, but on the other hand, look at secular society and they have a lot of problems too. So in a way, what we can say is, again, here we kind of have to integrate a system of values, some of which are drawn from secular society. There isn't a ton in the Torah about boundaries and consent. You know, you talked about obligation for sex and marriage, and sometimes even that can create mental health problems when there's a feeling of not having consent. And so I appreciate how you framed it. I'm going to let Rav Scott ask the next question. Thank you.
Thank you, Talli. I think this segues well from what we just said, Rav Yoni, because a lot of Orthodox Jews are often nervous when people seem to be looking for leniencies, even if the reason for looking for the leniency is coming from a positive place, a desire to be able to integrate halacha with their lives in a way that won't completely make them feel burdened to the degree they're not themselves anymore. And this comes up particularly when we're talking about the halachot of sex. So unless the reasons for the leniency in particular are obviously within the boundaries of normative halacha, a lot of people are afraid that these leniencies, these kulot, can lead to a slippery slope which undermines the entire system of halacha. I'll give you just an example. You and I talked about on my other podcast, Orthodox Conundrum, we talked about the possibility, and I actually want to talk about this in a later question, but the possibility in some circumstances for a woman in Nidah to only wait 7 days instead of also waiting Sheva Nikiyim, in other words, Nidah D'Oraita, so to speak. That's something which is not an obvious halachic leniency, which is possible, although some people might say that it's necessary in certain contexts. So my question for you is, how can one decide, and by one, I'm using that sort of in a deliberately open way, whether it's the person or a rabbi or somebody else, how does somebody decide when it's acceptable to use or offer a leniency, whether the person is the one using the leniency or whether it's a rabbi or a halachic authority giving leniency, when that leniency might be considered somewhat novel?
Great question. Let's get. I'm gonna get technical for a second, and then I'll try to bird's eye view it. Okay. So let's first get technical. First of all, we need to make certain distinctions. Okay. Distinction number one is between what I would call essential problems and structural problems. In other words, there are essential problems, right? Things that the Torah explicitly ushered, right? Where you would say, okay, that's just prohibited. You can't do that. And there are things which, are more structural in nature. In other words, the thing might be allowed in certain situations, but we generally frown upon it because we don't want to open up, so to speak, a gateway to worse things, right? Or what people call a slippery slope sometimes, et cetera. There are definitely many slippery slope sort of halachas that appear within sexual framework. And some of those are easier to be lenient on where there's a need than the other things, right? So for example, if someone came to me and said to me, okay, I am in love with a non-Jewish woman. If I don't marry her, I'm going to have depression, anxiety, I don't know, whatever. You can make a litany of things, right? I still couldn't allow him to marry that woman. That's intermarriage. And he cannot marry a non-Jewish woman. Just can't. There's nothing I can do about it, right? There's no way around that. It's not something where I can say, well,
there is no other hand.
Right. There's no other hand. Exactly. Right. And people, and I have been asked a question like that in the past. That's how it is, right? Look, there are many things we can try to convince her to convert. We can do a lot of things. Yeah. But there are some things I just can't say yes to, right? There's an essential issue and it's impassable. Of course, other issues are more structural in nature. Like I said, in other words, they're systemic. They come to preserve the system. And to say, look, we don't want to make distinctions because it'll confuse people or because people will take that distinction and then take it farther than it's supposed to go, whatever it is. And sometimes that's definitely so. But when faced with a certain kind of case, you can be more lenient on that specific issue because it's not essentially a problem. It's just coming to preserve the system and to make sure that the society as a whole, is functioning according to the law. But fine. Right, that's technical distinction number one. Distinction number two is obviously between different kinds of cases. Obviously, when I come to answer a shaila, and this was your question, Rav Scott, about how one would answer or consider a leniency, it will depend on two things. Number one, the severity of the issue that is being considered. I kind of just discussed that. But number two is, of course, the status of the person. right? To me, it's very different if the person is chol sheyesh b'sakana, chol she'en b'sakana, someone who's in a life-threatening situation, someone who is, so to speak, only, in quotation marks, only chol she'en b'sakana, meaning only sick or unwell or whatever you want to call it, and someone who is generally actually well, but just wants something a little bit easier, etc. All those things are different, and I would have to evaluate each case, separately, right? So that's in terms of the technical side of things. But let me take a little bird's eye view of that now and just answer your question more completely. I think that people generally don't want leniencies. What I mean by that is that someone who doesn't care just won't care and won't ask me. Those people who care, those people who raise these issues, what they want to do is live a life that is religious. They want to live a life of commitment to God. And that's why they're coming to a rabbi. Coming to me, and I, with almost any question, but you can imagine how much more so with a question that has to do with sexual intimacy. I mean, to come to a rabbi and talk about one of the most intimate, personal, private issues in your life, right? You would only do that if it was important to you.
Or your husband.
Right. Fair enough. You'd only do that if it was important to someone. Okay, let's put it that way. Because Talli, I'm sure it's true for you too. Even to go to a therapist and talk about it in a closed room with a promise of confidentiality, still it's embarrassing and it's complicated, etc. For someone to know your secret and to know what's going on, that's lo pashut. It's not simple at all for a person to do. And if they're doing it, it's because it's important for them. So if they come to you, Talli, I assume it's because it's important to them to fix their relationship, or it's important to them to not be suffering so much, which is, what's happening, right? So for me also, right, if someone's coming to me, right, as a rabbi, it's because their connection and their relationship with God means something to them or to their spouse or whatever it is, it's important to them. So therefore, what they want is not for me to tell them, look, you know what? You're not obligated in anything. You're good to go. If I said that, they wouldn't even accept it most of the time because they want to be obligated in something. They just want to do it right and in a way that works and jives with their mental health and their physical health and everything else. They don't want to give up on their relationship with Hashem. They're not looking for an out in that sense. They're looking for an in. They're looking for a way to continue doing it, but in a way that makes sense to them and that takes into account their specific living conditions. So I'm trying to find a way to make that happen for them. So my goal there, right, is to look at their situation and to say, not in a sense, what leniency I can give you, but to say to the person, look, how do we move forwards from here so that in 2, 3, 5, 10, 12 months, you're feeling better. You're feeling better about yourself. You're feeling better about your Judaism. You're feeling better about everything that's going on, right? Because I don't want to strip you of your orthodoxy, of your halacha, of your belief in God, of your connection with Hashem. I don't want to take that away from you. I'd be a very poor rabbi if I did that. What I want to do is to strengthen that connection, which is on the rocks right now because of how it's affecting your mental health. So I want to strengthen that. I want to strengthen all the parts, right? So in that sense, I need to look at that and see what that is. Sometimes, yes, of course, sometimes that means offering a leniency, but not always. And even when I do offer a leniency, of course, it goes through certain stringencies, meaning I try to say to the person, look, yes, do this, but do it in a certain way that is more stringent so that you're not violating it completely, right? Once again, the goal is not just technically to find a loophole. That's part of it, but it's not the whole thing. I also want the person to feel, like they're still religious, like they're still part of the community, like they're still doing something. To let them off the hook completely is not a good idea. I think Talli also would agree with me. It's not just a good idea, even mentally, it's not a good idea to let a person off the hook completely. Like they should feel some sense of responsibility and, et cetera, for what's going on and try to make things better, try to work on it, try to get back to a better place or whatever it is, but on a temporary level, sure. So to answer the question that was put to me by Rav Scott, in summary, I look at the person and I try to think about how I want their life to look 10 months down the line, 12 months down the line, and say to myself, how do I get there? And if the way to get there is through offering a temporary leniency on something specific in order to make sure that they can get back on their feet, get their strength back, move forwards, get to a better, then yes, of course, I will definitely do so. Once again, as long as it's not running into the first problem, which I mentioned about it being an essential issue which cannot be overcome. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I like that answer. But I'd like to follow up because there are some situations, admittedly not the ones we've been talking about, but the person isn't coming to a rabbi or a halachic authority because there's a problem. They want to know what to do. Let me give you an example. I don't teach any more chatan classes, but when I used to teach chatan classes, they're not coming because there's an issue. They're coming because perhaps that's what you do. They're coming because presumably on some level they want to keep the laws of Taharat Mishpacha, the laws of Nida. But on the other hand, it's not as though they necessarily know what that really involves. And sometimes I'm curious how you would respond to a couple that comes to you that, let's say, your guess or your knowledge is they're not that religious. So therefore, should you present to them, in this example, Hilchot Nida, as it is according to Midoraita, Midorabanan, according to all the minhagim, exactly as we do it? Or do you say, I'm going to make an assessment over here that if I do that, they're going to run away. They're just not going to do it. And better that I teach them something a little more lenient and say, well, this is really, these harchakot are not necessarily that important for you. I don't know how you exactly would put it. That was a struggle I always had. And frankly, my default position was I'm going to present the halacha as I understand the halacha. And if they choose to do differently, that's up to them. And I even said that to them. But I would not just assume that they want leniencies. I'm not sure that everyone would agree with that. What's your take on that?
I think that my attitude is similar to yours. I'm not entirely sure what you say to them, but it sounds like you would say something very similar to me. So what I would say to a couple, like I would say, there are a lot of halachas about this topic that you're asking. I could go through everything if you want me to, but I'm not sure that that's for you. I'm happy to discuss some basic things, and we'll take it from there. If you want me to, I'll discuss everything with you, and I want you to that's my way of saying, I want you to know that there's more here that I'm not telling you, etc. But I don't necessarily have to go through everything and explain it to them. It's enough for me to give, so to speak, like that disclaimer. Like I would say, I would never say to the person, I would never make an assessment and hide the truth, so to speak, and say, look, this is the halacha, but not really tell them what it is. No, I would usually make the disclaimer. I would usually say, there's a lot here. I'm not sure it's for you. If you want me to go through everything, I will tell you everything. But if you want me to kind of tell you what I think you guys can do right now, then I will.
Okay, thank you.
I'm listening to this discussion, and it really, to me, indicates so much how important it is for rabbis to have sufficient pastoral counseling skills to recognize or to even ask when they're not sure what's behind the question, what's the possible distress, what's happening in the relationship, to know how and when to refer, and to kind of follow up on this whole idea of rabbinical asking and getting answers. I would like to jump on this issue of mental health, where you talked about in situations of, for example, depression or fasting you've written about it as well, about fasting when there's eating disorders. We talk a lot about how the Torah has a great deal of caring and compassion for mental health, and that mental illness is considered refuah, like physical illness. But my question is a little bit more nuanced, having to do with the maintenance of emotional wellness, the maintenance of feelings of control and autonomy in your life, as opposed to necessarily having to pathologize yourself in order to get a heter. I'll tell you what I mean. So I work a lot with the Haredi population, and the kind of go-to there is that the default is you get this amount of time for birth control between children. But if you are able to demonstrate that you have anxiety or depression, then you can get more time. So in effect, there's an exchange of leniency for the proof of actual pathology. And you were saying something very different. You were saying people want to maintain their sense of self. They want to keep halacha, and they want to feel like they're doing the right thing, and they don't want to be pathologized. And I'll give you one other example. For many women, men as well, the laws around nida, contact, touch, depending on your style of attachment. Okay, if you have an anxious attachment style, or if you have a great deal of sensitivity to abandonment. I'm not talking about having trauma. I'm not talking about having to come and say, I have complex PTSD or borderline, or I'm suicidal. Those are reasons which I'm sure you would be able to more easily provide leniency around touch during times of harchakot. But I'm talking about women or men who will say, it's really bad for me. It makes me feel bad. It's really hard for me. That's very nuanced. It's not a spectrum. And so where along the spectrum does it become not legitimate? Sorry, buddy. Like halacha is hard, but you still got to do what you got to do. And I'm not, look, obviously there are going to be people who are going to not ask any rabbi and just do what feels right for them. But I'm talking about the people who you say there are people who are conflicted because one part of them is very, very committed to following halacha exactly. And then another part of them, it's not really good for their mental health. It's not a pathology. We're not dealing with a disorder. So I think you understand my question.
Yes, I do understand your question. And I think that this will be the most vague answer I give on your podcast today. But I will try to make it as clear as I can. There's a problem, okay? I think you will basically not find almost at all anything written on this in the literature, and I'll tell you why. Because you're talking more about or something that's closer to the term quality of life, where the person basically is not necessarily in pain or suffering. They just know that they could live a better life in a certain way. In other words, that if they had more of this or more of that, their emotional well-being would be propped up, would be better, they would be happier, they would be more of a good thing, so to speak, rather than, as you say, them like in the depths of depression or suffering from anxiety or having PTSD or OCD or all this stuff, etc. And here's the problem. The problem is that so to speak, I don't know if to say the official stance, but the official stance of the Orthodox Party, so to speak, is that the best life is a religious life. The best emotional well-being that a person can have is by following the Torah. There would be no other thing. It's impossible to imagine a person, in a sense, right, coming and saying, I am a religious person, and I think that my emotional well-being will be better served if I don't follow the halacha. Like, how could that be, right? It could be that the halacha might interfere with a person's like I said, it could cause a person pain or suffering in a certain situation if he follows the halacha because of his life circumstance. But and that is what we spoke about before, of a chole or someone who is in a life-threatening situation. But to imply that a person's life would be better if they didn't keep the halacha, that as like a rule, like their emotional well-being would just be better off. I mean, that is something that I don't think any book would ever be willing to even entertain. Any safer would be willing to entertain, such an idea, right? So therefore, it's more complicated than that. With all that said, of course that happens. Meaning, of course, we know that it occurs, right? People's well-being, many times, their emotional well-being is impacted, by the halacha. So what do we say in that situation? Well, you're right. Many times we'll say to the person, you just have to keep a stiff upper lip, and pull through and get through it. And that's certainly justified sometimes. Like we do, maybe I think in this generation, we are a little bit light on the ability to form resilience and to get through tough situations and to, et cetera. Like some of the talk, even during this war, to me is a little bit over the top. Or when people say, we'll never come back from this, the calamity is beyond any, I mean, I'm not saying it's not terrible what's happening, but I feel like some of the rhetoric is like so over the top, So I think that people do need to have resilience, etc. But I will just say one last word, which is that as a rabbi, when I do get questions like this, I do try to understand where the person's coming from and offer them, I wouldn't say a leniency, but a slight perspective on this that might be helpful to them, to understand maybe where the halacha is coming from. And yes, sometimes also maybe a leniency, if it's a light leniency, in order to kind of like take the edge off the pain, etc. But I think that generally I try to build resilience in the person and to say to them, yeah, okay, sometimes things are hard. Look, I'll say one last thing. I always say, we tell our kids, the schools tell our kids, the rabbis tell our kids, halacha is meant to be hard. Yes, halacha is not meant to be easy, but halacha is also not meant to cause pain. So there's a difference in pain and suffering and hard. Getting up every morning and putting on tefillin, sure, that's a challenge and it's hard for some people, etc. Keeping Shabbos, not being on your phone for 24 hours, for me, it's really easy, but for some people that may be hard, etc. Yes, but there's a difference between hard and painful or causing suffering. I don't know anywhere that it says that halacha is supposed to cause pain and suffering. So if that's happening, obviously, we should put a stop to it. But if it's just hard, then yes, that I think on some level we do need to build resilience.
Yeah, it's very difficult because for many of the people asking questions, particularly women, and particularly so in Haredi society, there isn't access to texts and they don't have access to different interpretations of halacha. Halacha is what their rabbi tells them. And so it isn't really about following the Torah. It's about following what they are told to follow. And it becomes a very objective standard when, in fact, there may be leniencies available, but they are not at the mercy of the Torah. They're at the mercy of the particular Rav or Admor or person who is giving them the specific information. So in those cases, there might need to be, again, like I have to be able to demonstrate depression or anxiety, or else I will have 12 kids, whether I want 12 kids or not. That's just a little point that I want to add in there. And that's a societal thing. It's not a halachic thing.
Right. 100%.
Yeah.
100%.
That actually leads to another question, which I wanted to ask you, Rav Yoni, about autonomy in halachic decision-making for couples. And let me give an example that we've talked about on this podcast itself. An example is non-vaginal sex, which has different opinions in halacha. In non-vaginal sex, in married couples I'm talking about, assuming they're not in nida, there is one school of thought, broadly speaking, which is relatively permissive, and there's one school of thought, broadly speaking, which is relatively not permissive. In fact, it's very not permissive. And the question some people might have is, does a couple need to go to a rabbi and ask him which opinion do I need to follow? Or is a couple allowed to say, assuming they have a basic literacy, I don't mean they're Talmidei Chachamim, but they have a basic understanding of the two approaches. I'm calling it two approaches. It's actually more than that, but I'm using that for the sake of simplicity. Can they say, you know what, we know both approaches, and we're going to decide what works for us? Following up on what Talli said before about people not knowing what they can do and having to go to a Rav or an Admor to get permission to have fewer than 12 kids. So the question here is, at what point can a person who is a caring religious Jew, someone who wants to be a Torah Jew, and who also wants to maintain a measure of autonomy, but doesn't pretend that he or she has the knowledge of a Rav, they have a basic knowledge. Where does autonomy begin? Or maybe I should say, where does autonomy end and where does a Rav's role begin? At what point can a couple decide this is something for us to decide on our own?
Right. The answer to that, I think, is that it will depend, of course, on the person and the situation. So what do I mean by that? Generally, I'm a big fan of autonomy. I'm a big fan of empowering people. I have a very specific stance about this, specifically, let's say, with having children, right? That's to me very important. People come to me and ask whether they can, how long they can wait and between children, and can they wait before they have the first child, and this and this and that. And what I tell them when they come to me for those questions is I say to them, look, I cannot imagine a scenario where it would be right for a rabbi to tell you when to have a child. I know that some rabbis do that. I don't like that. I think that if a child is going to be brought into this world, then the people who are going to bring him into the world and take care of him and finance him and raise him and educate him should be the ones to make the decision. I don't think any rabbi should make that decision for the couple. What I do think is that, of course, there are halachic considerations. So we should teach people what the halachic considerations are and let them make the decision, right? So that's what I do. But when I sit with a couple, I say to them, look, you need to make the decision. I can't make the decision. But here's what I would take into account as a rabbi when I'm thinking about this. And I explained to them about the mitzvah of Pirei V'Rivya and about Lashevet Yetzara and the Erev Al Tanach Yadcha, all the mitzvahs that are implied. And I explain what the borderlines of the borders of the mitzvah are and what they imply, and et cetera. And we talk about it. We talk ashkafically, et cetera. But at the end of the day, right, I don't want to be giving people decision, like making decisions for them when they have a child. I think that's incorrect to do. When it comes to other sorts of questions that you mentioned, right, like sexual activity and behavior, et cetera. On the one hand, those things are very private, and I don't think that it's impossible to teach people about that as well. However, I will say one thing, which is that one of the reasons, and once again, I'm sure that it changes from person to person, which is what I started off by saying, but one of the reasons people come to a rabbi is because they don't want to make the decision on these issues. In other words, they feel that they're out of their depth. Even if you explain it to them, they feel like they're out of their depth. In other words, they feel like they don't want to take responsibility for this. It seems like a tricky subject. It seems like something that so to speak, they'll go to hell for if they do the wrong thing, etc. And they want the rabbi to make the decision. They want the rabbi to take the responsibility. I once heard this from Rav Cohen, who was Rosh Yeshiva of Otniel. He once said, "Lifamim anashim rotzim she'arav yelech legehenom bishvilam." Sometimes people want the Rav to go to hell for them. So, it's fair enough. Like in the modern Orthodox community, we like to empower people, but when you empower people, you also put the responsibility on them. And some people like their rabbis taking responsibility. So, 100%. I think that in general, it is possible to empower people and give them the information. I don't think that rabbis should assume that that's what the person who's asking you is automatically looking for all the time.
I'll just add to that, Rav Yoni, and I don't know if you agree with this. My feeling about that is, apart from agreeing with what you said, that there is a problem when people think that rabbis are like an oracle, or maybe to put it in different terms, the way that a Kohen was with the dinam, with the laws of tzarat, where his determination of what is tzarat actually is what makes it so on some level. It's causative and not just determinative.
Right.
And people often treat rabbis in the same way. Like if you get a heter for birth control, that makes it so. And if you don't get a heter, then you don't have that heter, as opposed to, I'm just looking for information about what to do. I think that's not a healthy way of looking at rabbis. And I've often heard people complain about rabbis who have the temerity to say, you can't have birth control. They're not giving me a heter, as if they could change it on their own. Or if they do give a heter, somehow that makes it so. But I don't think that's really the case.
Yeah. I completely agree with what you just said. Yep.
Okay, we're almost out of time. We're recording this on the week of Shiva for those 6 hostages who were murdered this week. We can't not think about the war. So Talli and I think, would also like to hear a little bit about some of the unique questions regarding war and intimacy that you have received over the past 11 months, some that you could perhaps share with us that would be enlightening for our audience.
And preferably also the answers.
Yeah, the most, obviously, the most pressing questions that I get have to do with touch, with negia, right? So, or sexual relations. But those are the main questions that, once again, I'm talking about the intersection, a very specific intersection of halacha and intimacy and war, right? So, yes. In that very specific intersection, I would say that the majority of the questions that I get have to do with touch, but they come in very different ways, right? So some of them are direct and some are indirect. What do I mean by that, right? There could be a direct question that has to do with the war. So let's say a person says, I've been in Gaza X amount of time. I'm coming home just for 36 hours. My wife is Nida. Can we touch? What can we do? Et cetera, right? That's a question that is directly affected by the war, in the sense that the person's schedule in the war, is what's causing the problem, right? There are questions that are, in a sense, you could say, indirect, in the sense that the war didn't cause them directly, but they've caused a situation, and now that situation is affecting. So what I spoke about, let's say, with Rav Scott on his podcast, Orthodox Conundrum, was a case of someone who came back from the war. He's no longer in the war. He's been home for months. But the war has created a situation of PTSD with a person. And now PTSD is affecting the household. And now affecting the household, affecting the relationship. And since affecting the relationship, it might affect, right, how often the couple can be together. And it could affect Shiva Nikiim. And I'm happy to expound on that, a little bit later. We'll see how much time we have. Yeah. But the point is there are questions that are more direct and the questions that are less direct is my point. Okay. The Negia one, right, the touch one is comes in all shapes and sizes. So one example is the one I gave before of a husband who comes home just for a limited amount of time. I got this a lot at the beginning of the war, less today, but certainly more at the beginning of the war. There are sometimes questions that are not that are more about anxiety. A person is, let's say, anxious about the war. They want to hold their husband's hand, or the husband, right? They wake up in the middle of the night. They need a hug, or whatever it is, because of the news, because of what's going on, the situation, or they have a child, who's, in Gaza or whatever it is, right?
Or they're mourning.
Correct, 100%. Or they're mourning. And that comes once again, like at a time, right, when the husband and wife can't touch, and suddenly, God forbid, they lost a child or whatever it is. Yes, those questions, as I said, come in all shapes and sizes. But here is the answer, okay, that I give to most of these questions, right? The basic distinction to be made is between what I call magashel tmicha and magashel chiba. So affectionate touch versus supportive touch. To be very honest, I don't know that every posek would agree that such a distinction exists, but I do believe that it exists, and I believe that there are sources that show it exists. And I've asked rabbis and poskim, and they've also told me that it does exist. So supportive touch has a non-affectionate, has an affectionate component, but also a non-affectionate component, right? As I always say, maybe this will explain the point, right? Your wife is basically the only family member that you also have a sexual relationship with. In other words, she's the only family member who's also not a family member, who's just like a woman, so to speak. All the other women out there, you're not allowed to have any sexual relations with. All the other family out there, you're not supposed to have, and hopefully don't want to have, sexual relations with, right? Your wife, you do. Yeah, she's also a family member. She's also family, but she's also a sexual partner. So the relationship is complicated. And sometimes you relate to your wife as family, and sometimes you relate to her, so to speak, as a sexual partner, and it changes. When a person, that's why it's so tricky. But yes, there could definitely be a touch that is, so to speak, affectionate, but is basically supportive. In other words, it carries with it affection, but it's the affection of a familial bond rather than a sexual bond between a man and a woman, who are married. So that sort of supportive touch, I think, carries a different halachic level than regular affectionate touch, and would be allowed in times of stress and sickness and need. I usually tell people to do that through clothing if possible. So a hug is through clothing. You know what I'm saying? Like that sort of thing. Or I've heard from certain rabbis to do with a shinui. So what does a shinui mean? It would mean like putting, rather than holding hands like in the classic way, but to put a hand within a hand, etc. The back of your hand into the hand of the person, or instead of giving a kiss, on the cheek or on the lips, to give a kiss on the forehead, would be like a shinui, etc. That sort of thing. Things that imply that it's obviously more for support than it is for the regular kind of affection that a person has. These are things that I think could be more acceptable in those scenarios. So that's one kind of example of a question. Like I said, I get that in many sorts of ways. Other questions that come up have to do with shortening or dealing with the question of Shiva Nikiim, of the waiting period. Without going into too much detail, I think any rabbi knows that shortening the 5 days or the days before the Shiva Nikiim, shortening the days before you enter the 7 clean days is easier halachically. The options there's a myriad of options, there are many options. And if one can do that, then great. Many times the questions come too late, meaning the questions come at a moment's notice, right? So the person didn't know that they would need to, think that much in advance. So they do come during the 7 clean days. And generally during the 7 clean days, things become more fraught. And it's not possible to just like do 5 clean days instead of 7 or things along those lines. That's not really an option. So once you're in the 7 clean days, it's either or, meaning either you go through with it completely or you don't, right? And once again, here as well, I will just say, I have received from women different feedback, okay? So some women have told me that keeping the halachas to the letter has given them strength during the war, has given them stability during the war. And even though it's caused, obviously, certain problems, with their husbands and this and that, or caused them some suffering or pain or whatever you want to call it, that hardship was experienced as spiritually uplifting, and kind of like a sacrifice that we're doing in order to win the war and to get Hashem on our side, or whatever you want to call it, etc. That's how they experience it personally. So, I've heard that feedback, and it's interesting. Of course, the other side of that is that some women don't experience it that way. They feel that hardship very, very significantly. And here, I have asked rabbis questions about doing away temporarily with the 7 clean days, and I've received different answers. Obviously, some rabbis say no, say it's not possible. There's absolutely no possibility. And other rabbis have been more open to the possibility in certain situations, right? So let's say the case of PTSD, which I gave before, where a person basically is completely and absolutely in a state of crisis, personally and with regards to the wife, where Shalom Bait is being affected, the house, the family, the kids, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe, right, one of the ways that they can get back to each other is by shortening the period that they are usher to each other. I have heard rabbis who are willing to consider certain leniencies in that situation, whether it has to do only with negia, meaning chibuk v'nishuk, kissing, hugging, etc., or even full-on like sexual relations. There are rabbis who are willing to say what you call nida deoraita. That's obviously not something that I think most rabbis would agree with. To be honest, I think it's a more of an extreme position. But yes, I've heard rabbis who have taken that. So it will depend on the case and the situation, is what I would say.
Just one clarification. I assume that even those people who'd be the most lenient would not say that it's after 5 days. It would still be after 7 days from the day the woman got her period, just to make sure that's clear.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. 7 days after the woman got her period, and only once she's stopped getting her period, meaning she also has to stop getting it before that also is a condition there for other reasons. But yes.
Such important information, because some of our listeners out there may not be aware, even though there has been, if you're living in Israel and you're Israeli and you're on social media, there have been a lot of organizations, and certainly also the Yoatzot Halacha have dealt with this. But the fact that we can be on our Intimate Judaism podcast and talk about the fact that there really is conversation going on about the ability to touch with certain aspects of, like, as you said, with the clothing and it being a supportive touch as opposed to a sexual touch. And also this idea of nida d'oraita being a possibility even. I think this is so important for people out there to know that you can ask. You can ask the rabbis with broad shoulders like Rav Yoni. And it's also important to point out, we're speaking about the intersection between war and intimacy and halacha. And I deal a lot with the intersection between war and intimacy and just trauma and issues. PTSD is very, very complicated, and it really does have an effect on intimacy in many, many different ways, which is important also for the rabbis to understand. Just a quick example that what we see a lot in PTSD, in combat PTSD, is a great deal of horror, and horror with feelings of arousal and also moral injury and a lot of difficulty in regulation. And so really, sex can be a very, very difficult place for a combat soldier returning from war. They actually may be more inclined to be self-soothing with masturbation and pornography. That's what we see clinically. And that's an important thing for rabbis to know, that often pornography serves as a way to numb and self-soothe in a way that partnered intimacy and sex can be very anxiety provoking for young men with symptoms of PTSD.
Right. And I guess I'll just add, as a result of what you just said, right, is that I know that, for some listening to this, I assume that, me saying that there are some rabbis who would allow, to do away with Shiva Nikiim might sound extreme, right? And I'm not saying that it's not extreme. As I said, I think it's definitely more of a minority opinion. But what you said is so important, meaning what is the alternative? People don't always understand what people are dealing with, right? If people understand PTSD more, they understand what the person is going through, they understand what that crisis looks like. I mean, I'm not saying that they would still agree, with such a psak. They might still disagree, but it is important to understand it, to understand what that actually looks like, what that person's life looks like. It's beyond imagining, really. Like, you really have to talk to a person to understand it, and then you can start getting an appreciation for why a rabbi would even consider, to be lenient on something.
Well, I'm not saying to be lenient on sex with your partner in order to substitute for what pornography does. I'm just kind of throwing it out there as something that's important for rabbis to also understand, because couples will come into the clinic and say, he doesn't want to have sex with me, and I saw porn on his computer. Why? And this is an important understanding of, there's a very, very big difference between self-soothing and numbing and sex with your partner, which requires a lot more presence and intimacy skills and being able to regulate yourself. So my point was to say that it's not a substitute, and it never is going to be a substitute because it's not the same experience.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. I was less commenting on that and more commenting simply on the halachics of it. In other words, that the halachic evaluation is many times affected by the understanding of the mental health condition. For sure.
Great. Thank you so much.
Simcha.
Rav Yoni, thank you so much for joining us, and thank everybody for joining us once again for another season of Intimate Judaism. Remember to check out our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah checklist, and more. Remember to subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts, and share it so we can continue to grow our audience. Thank you for joining us.